92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and on digital radio. BBC Radio Scotland.
Hello, I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to this week's edition of The Big Debate, which comes from the Denny Civic Theatre in Dumbarton. We'll be talking about the election, needless to say. We'll be talking about the report on blood contamination, which came out this week. We'll be talking about David Cameron's statement that he won't serve a third term as Prime Minister. On our panel today, we have Brian Donohoe, who's the Labour MP for Central Ayrshire, Jackson Carlaw, who's the Conservative MSP for the West of Scotland, Stuart McMillan, the SNP MSP for the West of Scotland, Jill Swinson, who's Liberal Democrat MP for East Dunbartonshire and UK Minister for Employment Relations and Consumer Affairs, and last but certainly not least, Paul McNamee, who is editor of The Big Issue magazine. And let's get straight down to it with a question from Maggie Marshall.
Should the NHS apologise for mistakes which they may claim were unavoidable at the time? Or how much of the action can actually be attributed to medical negligence lawyers? OK, and
can I just ask you what you mean by your question? Obviously, both the Scottish Government and the British Government have apologised, but you're suggesting it should be the National Health Service itself?
No, I think it is the role of the Government to represent the NHS on this issue. So what I'm trying to ascertain is who's driving the force behind this.
Well, I wonder, Paul McNamee, what you make of this. Of course, the background to this, the Penrose report came out this week. And while it is true that both Nicola Sturgeon and David Cameron have apologised on behalf of their respective governments, although, of course, we should say that neither of those individuals were in power at the time, some of the victims of this are very angry because they feel things should have gone much further. And they were particularly, I think, disturbed that the only recommendation of the report was that people who hadn't had their blood tested should have their blood tested.
Yeah, it's a horrific thing that happened, and it does look as though terrible things happened in the 70s, whether it's in this through into the 80s or whether it was Jimmy Savile. All these elements, it looks as though these things happened in the past, and we now have to apologise and pay the cost for it. And I think that is probably right, because ultimately somebody's got to carry the can for this. You cannot put it down just to lawyers trying to kick it out or obfuscate and put things in the way. It can't just be negligence. Somebody's got to stand up, put their hand up and say, this is my fault. Now, in these inquiries, and ironically with David Cameron, one of the first things that he did when he took over as Prime Minister was apologise for Bloody Sunday. It was one of the very first and one of the very last things that he has done is apologise for what happened to contaminated blood. So his premiership has been marked by government apologies for things that happened in the past. But I think that's good, and that's as it should be. They have to accept responsibility, because if they don't, then all these poor people who are getting a paltry sum for suffering and for their family suffering, it looks as though nobody really cares. And I think they're right to be angry that there's only one recommendation, because something has to come out of the inquiries. There are so many, and it feels as though we're in a constant state of trying to search for the truth, but that's okay. If it takes time to shine this light and to bring these things to the surface, excuse me for mixing those metaphors, that's as it should be.
Well, Stuart McMillan, what do you make of this? Paul McNamee is right to say that individuals are not being held responsible, but should it be necessary to some form of resolution of this that individuals are held responsible?
I think, going back to the original question, first of all, I do think it's right and proper that the politicians did apologise. Now, certainly we had the Penrose Inquiry, and Nicola Sturgeon, before she became First Minister, even before she was in government, she was campaigning for an inquiry to actually take place. And then 2008, she instigated the Penrose Inquiry. And obviously we had the report published this week. And I was in the chamber yesterday when the Health Secretary gave the statement on Penrose, and the Health Secretary apologised also. But certainly, one of the things that came out clear for me throughout the week was the fact that the First Minister had stated that the publication of this report, this is not the end of the situation. This is now it's the beginning of the next part and the next stage, and actually trying to get to a more successful and more and to get to a better outcome, particularly for everyone who's actually been adversely affected, certainly particularly with their health.
Oh, Brian Donohoe.
Well, first of all, our thoughts must go to the victims that have suffered as a consequence of this. I actually was the full-time official for the trade union that covered blood transfusion along that period. And if my recollection is correct, I think the Chief Exec actually got sacked as a result of inefficiencies within the service itself. Not related to this, it has to be said.
The Chief Executive of what?
Of the blood transfusion service,
right,
which was arm's length as an agency at the time when I was a trade union official. But really, I mean, we've got to move forward. I've got constituents that have been paid compensation for this, but compensation is only one area that should be looked at. We should be accelerating the programme to improve drugs that treat the disease that's been injected into these people by whatever means, in order that we can overcome their problems. Some of the cases I've seen at first hand are really quite tragic as a consequence of them being given a blood transfusion that was infected by this, and really feel very strongly that it's down to trying to improve the well-being of these people.
Jill Swinson.
Well, I agree with much of what Brian said there and others. It's horrendous to think that somebody goes along for a medical procedure because they need help and medical care, and as a result of that they actually end up contracting a horrendous disease in their blood.
Sorry, can you understand the anger of some of the victims when this report came out? They felt that, look, after, 6 years of an inquiry, all that they really came up with was suggesting that people who hadn't had their blood tested and who had given blood in the relevant period should have a blood test. It seemed very anticlimactic.
Absolutely, I can understand that. I mean, I'm not in the position that Lord Penrose was in being able to look at all of the evidence over the time, and that's why you have an inquiry, to make sure that you can try to get to the truth. And it's possible that things could have been done differently, but clearly one of the things that the report has found is that there's not a huge number of things that, given the medical awareness at the time, could have been the case. But that's why I think it is important that the response to that is not only about implementing that recommendation, but it is about the additional funding in terms of compensation. And I mean, you can't make this right just with money, but at the same time, it is right to recognise that support should be given, as well as Brian said, making sure that additional ways in which these people can be helped, whether it's about making sure that the medical research is accelerated, whether it's about things that can assist in their everyday lives in dealing with the situation they now find themselves in. That's why both governments, I think, have very fully said we apologise for this and we take responsibility, and we will do what we can to improve the situation for these people who, understandably, are in a appalling situation and feeling very angry about it.
Jackson, Carlaw, these people are in an appalling situation, but do you think all of us perhaps have unrealistic expectations of these public inquiries?
Well, no, can I say first of all that I'm quietly proud of the fact that it was the Scottish Parliament, and let me pay tribute to Nicola Sturgeon, a Scottish Health Secretary, who initiated the inquiry that took place. Because I think a huge public service has been done. I think there is, whenever an inquiry is commissioned, a heightened sense of expectation, and of course amongst some people, really who have suffered personally, a very, very particular interest. And therefore, while some characterised the report when it was published as a whitewash, I don't. I mean, I think Lord Penrose is a hugely respected figure, and he put a great deal of effort into what he did. And I think what he has identified is that the apology that has been given is not just because it happened, it's because, frankly, he found that we were too slow in this country to start screening blood. And therefore, there were a lot of people who suffered, not just because it happened in the first place, but because we as a nation were too slow to react when others had reacted. But since then, and I think it's important the public are reassured on this point, all sorts of practices in the way the health service operates. It's no longer as paternalistic. There's far more sharing of information. Things are far more open than they were at that time. That things have moved on. So the number of recommendations, as you say, is distilled down to quite a limited extent to one principal one, which is trying to find, are there yet others who should be screened? So what's important after that is that the compensation package is put in place. The Scottish Government's responsible for the haemophiliac infection. The UK Government is responsible for the HIV infection. And I think that the compensation package that's now been put in place requires both governments to work very closely together to ensure that those who should have access to it do so at the earliest possible opportunity.
All right. The gentleman in the audience there, you've been very patient, sir.
The cost of this report was £12 million, quoted by the health spokesman for the BBC in one of the main news. Britain is not good in reports because it takes so long. Look at Chilcot, still never out. Bloody Sunday, Hillsborough, and this one with the blood. They're just diabolical, the whole country, on reports. And everybody who's involved in getting tainted by it, it's time to kind of either retire, move on, or die before MD has any word on it. So that's where every party, mostly the three at the right-hand side that stayed beside each other, who, even the panel today, they're beside each other for defence. And it so sticks out.
All right.
The rebels are to the left and the yes people are to the right.
Well, right, thanks. I
would put it the other way around.
The gentleman at the back there, yes, sir.
What's required is accountability and individual responsibility. No one takes the responsibility. No one puts his hands up and says, it was me. Collective responsibility from governments is nonsense. And the other gentleman's right. It takes years and years for wads of paper to come out you wouldn't wipe your backside with. It's absolute nonsense. People should stand up and say, I'm to blame. People should be sacked. And if they're dead, they should be bloody well named.
The gentleman at the front there.
Thank you. When Sheriff Principal Brian Lockhart conducted a fatal accident inquiry into deaths at a care home, he invited the lawyers who were representing the victims and their families to make submissions on the recommendations they would like to see him make. Did George Penrose do that? I don't know whether he did or not, but that's maybe something for the journalists among the panel to look into and tell us.